Born to Annoy, a dawning of awareness. Chapter 9. A policy of healthy neglect. Looking back on those days with Auntie Dolly and Beatty, before and during my teens, a pattern emerges in their method of childcare, which I have since termed a system of healthy neglect. A form of child-rearing which I in turn pursued with some success, I think, many years later, when I too became a parent. But that's for our Tom to decide. The need to provide me with a stable base, decent food and sufficient clothing were my aunt's obvious priorities. They also imposed a simple framework of rules, without making them seem to be an imposition. They were all too aware I was out of control, because my father had told them so, and that is why they'd taken over parental responsibility for me. At the same time, they'd evidently decided to reimpose control with a light hand. The principal rules were essentially about nutrition and the need for sleep. Meal times were sacrosanct and not subject to change without agreement. As I always had a healthy appetite and exercise tends to make one hungry, this stricture was never a major problem for me. At any rate, it was only an issue in terms of the evening meal, except at weekends, when I had the midday meal with Dolly, and Sundays when we all sat down together. Beatty, being a shopkeeper, worked most Saturdays. Dolly didn't. Furthermore, being a worker, albeit salaried staff, and a committed trade unionist, she would not work overtime except under the most exceptional circumstances. She claimed that workers needed more leisure time, not less, and if employers couldn't obtain the amount of production they needed from their existing workforce, they should take on more employees. Similarly, if they couldn't afford to pay decent wages, enabling their employees to provide for their families within the basic working hours, they weren't fit to employ anybody. What a contrast with today's employment culture, whereby British employers imbued with the spirit of Thatcherism, so ably continued by her confessed admirer Tony Blair, queue up with their begging bowls, expecting to be supplied with so-called apprentices paid for by the state, and with voluntary interns, that is, young people desperate for work experience, who fall over themselves to work long hours for no wages or salary to build up their CVs. My generation has a lot to answer for in this respect. At the end of the day, whatever part we played, we allowed this pathetic situation to come about during the Thatcher Major and Blair years. Having got that off my chest, back to the past, a comfortable time still endowed with the post-war spirit and a nation pulling together. A time of youthful hope and dreams of a better future. Bedtime rules were much more flexible. I had to be in by a certain time, which became later as I became older, but the time I actually went to bed tended to be determined by me, in the sense I would tell them when I was tired and wanted to go to bed. I can never remember either Beatty or Dolly imposing a specific time on me, or ever having an argument on this issue. This could very well be tied up with the fact I looked forward to being read to at night, and, if I left it too late, overtiredness would deprive me of my enjoyment of a complete chapter. This system of self-regulation carried on into later years, as it became my practice to read to myself before going to sleep. My aunts, of course, had ultimate control, because they could switch off my bedroom light, but I never remember having the light turned off before I put down my book and dozed off to sleep. My free time, that is the time I wasn't at school, was my own, and every encouragement was made to ensure I spent it outdoors, save when the weather was really bad. The rules in this respect were lax and simple. My aunts explained that whenever I was outdoors, I was their representative, and whatever I got up to, for good or ill, reflected back on them. Therefore, I should behave accordingly and treat others and the environment I was in with respect. I tried to live up to this injunction, although not always with success. They also insisted on knowing where I intended going. After all, they might need to rescue me. At the end of the day, I had exactly the same amount of freedom I'd enjoy whilst living with Dad, without the need for any deception on my part. In fact, if anything particularly exciting had happened, I found a willing audience I could relate it to. Dolly and Beatty were not overprotective in any way, shape or form. They believed children should enjoy their childhood. I was encouraged to climb trees, to make dens, to build tree houses, to take risks, within reason, to explore and learn about the world in which I lived. It was part of growing up, and they wanted me to learn from experience and to be self-confident. Essentially, they trusted me, within limits, a fact underlined by their decision to allow me to travel the 5-mile journey home alone from Gorton to Denton, and to teach me the basics of preparing food for myself. I became a latchkey kid once more, and proud of the fact. The summer school holidays following my 10th birthday carried this freedom to a new level. They decided I could be trusted to stay in Denton. I no longer had to travel into Gorton with Beatty and spend my time in the shop. Although they must have been in broad agreement, the roles my aunts played in my young life were quite different. Beatty was the person I turned to whenever I did myself some injury. She cleansed and tended my cuts and bruises. She tut-tutted and dried my tears and gave me a cuddle and generally fulfilled the role of a mother. Dolly was quite different. She encouraged my education, both in terms of assisting me with my schoolwork and by promoting a process of self-education. She was argumentative and taught me how to argue. She was instinctively anti-establishment and expecting me to follow her example. She questioned everything and taught me to do the same. Never take the wisdom handed down to you at face value, Malc, especially if it's being handed down by somebody in authority, not least politicians, vicars or bishops. Why? I asked. Dolly laughed. That's a good question. Let me put it like this. Where do you think we'd be if Galileo had listened to the Pope? I knew about Galileo. In fact, it was probably Dolly who told me about him. Right where we are now, on a planet going round the sun. Again she laughed. Maybe, she said. Except we probably would have still thought the sun was going around us. Always remember, Malc, nobody has a monopoly of the truth, and certainly not the church. If I ever had a problem or needed advice, it was Dolly I turned to. She became my rock. Her advice was good advice, and I still tried to follow it. That doesn't mean we didn't have our differences. We did, because I could be as argumentative as she, and I could question her wisdom just as she'd advised me to challenge that of others. I also had a wicked sense of humour and a talent for sarcasm. In many ways, by encouraging me, she'd made a rod for her own back, but even when I was at my most annoying, I always knew how important she was to me. Over the last few decades, I have heard various views expressed by politicians, leading social workers, academics, and a multitude of other experts, stressing the need for children to have father figures and male role models in their lives. There might well be some truth in what they say, but I can honestly state that in my key formative years, I didn't have a male role model, and I didn't need one. I had Auntie Dolly, and I can assure all the experts she was far superior to any mere male. Despite a dreary summer in terms of the weather and a miserable wet winter, I did a lot of growing up in the 12 months following my 10th birthday. With Mr. Flower's encouragement and assistance, I soon mastered the art of riding a bike. I also gave myself a shock. I soon became fed up with firing arrows at the target in the back garden, and began to wander further afield with the weapon. I'd built a treehouse high above the ground, a simple wooden platform near the giant's footprint, and one day as I approached, I spotted a bird silhouetted on one of the branches above. I had an arrow in place, quick as a flash, drew back the bow, took aim, and shot at the target. I expected the bird to fly, but as it stretched its wings, it toppled from its perch. It was a magpie, a beautiful, shimmering, black and white, bluey-green member of the crow family. My arrow had pierced the wing when it was attached to its body. I was devastated, This was one of the innocent creatures I was supposed to defend. Later that day, I unstrung my bow and never used it again, full of remorse and cursing myself for my cruelty. During the school holidays, I discovered Dolly and Beatty had rallied neighbours to help me make productive use of my freedom. Our next-door neighbours on one side were a young married couple with a baby daughter. The husband, Frank Cowle, was a long-distance lorry driver, working in partnership with his brother Phil, a coach driver, and his father, Joseph. Joseph Cowle and Sons Road Transport operated from a large garage near the trough in Ormshaw. If Frank had any short runs, usually picking up from one of Manchester's engineering factories, he would sometimes take me with him. On other occasions I spent time in the garage, cleaning the chrome strips and windows of their gleaming Foden coaches. Mr. Flowers also took time to keep an eye on me, not only teaching me how to ride a bike, but allowing me to watch and labour for him when he was custom building a motorbike, some of which were trials machines, and others for road racing in such events as the Manx TT. Above all, I had my bike, which extended the range I was able to explore dramatically. Dolly, of course, understood the possible implications of this. Motor cars were now becoming available at a price within the purchasing capacity of the higher-paid workers, and roads were becoming busier with traffic. My aunt had taken driving lessons, and was now the proud owner of a 1939 Series E Morris 8, a shiny model in British racing green with black mudguards fore and aft. Again, her lack of protectiveness and trust in my capabilities was reflected in her attitude. She gave me a copy of the highway code with the sections applicable to cyclists carefully marked. "You're a big boy now. You mustn't ride on the pavement. Make sure you read and understand the road safety rules. Be careful and sensible, and you'll come to no harm." Armed with her advice and having studied the rules, I set out one day. Hitherto, the River Tame had been the eastern frontier of my world. I decided to discover what lay on the other side of the river. I cycled down Naismith Avenue and eventually reached Hyde Road. I turned left, racing downhill to cross the river bridge, forsaking my native Lancashire for Cheshire, knowing I'd have a climb up the other side. What a climb! Who said Cheshire was flat? My initial momentum quickly ran out and I sweated and toiled uphill, determined not to get off and walk. Once over the canal, the gradient eased slightly, and I soon found myself at the crossroads in Hyde Town Centre, the magnificent town hall with its great clock tower across the road on my right, and the market thronged with shoppers on my left. Here I stopped for a break, conscious that the main road climbed even higher through the town. To cut a long story short, I eventually found myself on what, to me, seemed a wild moorland ridge high above the town, Werneth Low. Once I'd recovered my breath and steadied my trembling legs, I found a gap in a stone wall, scrambled through it with my bike and sank down gratefully on the short, sheep-cropped turf. I became conscious of a sound filling the air, burbling and echoing, a sound I had never heard before, a magical, bewitching sound. It was the song of a curlew, a song that whenever I hear it tells me I'm in the right place at the right time, almost 60 years later. As I gradually recovered from my exertions, I began to take my bearings. The textile town of Hyde lay below me, the River Tame, a brown meandering stream dividing it from Denton. In the further distance, the Manchester Corporation reservoirs near Debdale, just before the border with Gorton, were shimmering puddles of silver, and the great metropolis of Manchester could be made out through the vapour of a pale, yellowy-brown, smoky atmosphere. I felt as though I was on top of the world, a peddling version of Sherpa Tenzing, until I looked to my right and behind. Hill after heather-cloaked hill, alternating dark green, purple, and blue-black, met my gaze, and I realised there were far more hills to climb than I could hope to achieve that day. After communing with nature, I reluctantly decided to return home, looking forward to the long downhill run, which was my natural and rightful reward for my earlier efforts. I made it to the river without mishap and began to climb the hill. 20 yards before the junction with St. Anne's Road, I glanced over my shoulder. The road was clear. I signalled right with my outstretched hand and took my station immediately to the left-hand side of the white centre markings, as the highway code instructed. I rode in this fashion to the junction, signalling right once more as I heard a car coming up fast behind me. Much to my astonishment, as I was about to turn into St. Anne's Road, the vehicle overtook me on my right-hand side instead of my left. No collision occurred, but it was no thanks to the road dog. I carried out my anti-dollies and the Minister of Transport's instructions to the letter, but I'd also learned a valuable lesson. No matter how sensible you are, there's always some other idiot you have to be on the lookout for. Over the years, I've come to understand that Britain's roads provide a haven for more idiots than any other part of the country, and most of them are car drivers, although the majority of car drivers, thankfully, are not idiots. My life could have ended at that point. However, it didn't, and there are many more pages for you to wade through yet, dear reader, if you still have a mind to.